Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing Game 17 of the regular season for the San Jose Sharks as they took on the Minnesota Wild and won by a score of 2-1 in overtime. And with this victory, the Sharks now find themselves on a 4-game winning streak as well as a 7-game point streak, only having been interrupted by that Detroit shootout loss about a week ago. So San Jose, they have been winning a lot of games as of late, and now, at least at the time of this game finishing, perhaps the results for the rest of the night will change things, but at the time of this game finishing, they currently find themselves not only in a playoff spot, but actually top 3 in the Pacific Division. I don't think anybody at all was expecting this to be the case in the middle part of November. It is crazy the run that the Sharks have currently been on. As we have mentioned this in the past, they're basically playing with house money at this point. There's no expectations on this team. You compare this to, for instance, the Edmonton Oilers. The Oilers, if they were to miss the playoffs, it would be an absolute disaster. Heads would roll, changes would come, and even if they were to lose in like the first or second round of the playoffs, it would still be a very big issue. But for San Jose, if they make the playoffs, that's cool. If they miss the playoffs, that's fine too, because they are already doing much better than anybody was actually expecting to see from them thus far this season. Now, this is also the third time in a row where the Sharks have essentially won by a 2-1 score. Yes, the one against Winnipeg was technically 3-1, but with an empty netter, it's basically a 2-1 victory. Now, the one against Winnipeg, that was a game in which the Sharks absolutely deserved to win. They were the better team. They had outplayed the Jets. The one the very next day against the Florida Panthers, also a 2-1 victory in regulation. That was, a little bit more suspect. The Panthers had the majority of the possession in that one, and the Sharks were rather heavily reliant on their goaltender for that win. And here tonight, this game against Minnesota, a lot more reminiscent of the one against Florida. They again had to heavily lean on Askarov to actually steal this victory away, but it gets the job done, it gets the 2 points, and that's really what you're kind of taking out of a season like this one for the San Jose Sharks. Now, in the first period, this one actually is, I would say, slightly in favor of the Minnesota Wild, but in the end, it is still 0-0 after 20 minutes. It was the second period where things really got away for San Jose. The Wild were definitely the much better team in this middle frame, and they would add a power play goal for themselves coming from Matt Boldy to make it 1-0 Minnesota. We had seen the San Jose Sharks had a pretty much pristine penalty kill record over these last few games. That came to an end with this one. And I had mentioned earlier on in the season when the Sharks penalty kill was really struggling that their major issue was allowing way too many passes through into that kind of box formation, cross-ice passes. That's actually exactly what we see on this Boldy goal. Matt Zuccarello gets a really nice pass right across for Matt Boldy. This puts Askarov in a really tough position, and especially with where Boldy ends up placing this shot, this is basically an impossible save. That makes it 1-0 for Minnesota, and that is the score heading into that final period. Now, over these last 6 years of the Sharks missing the playoffs, we have been conditioned into believing that this type of positioning in a game like this was basically a sure loss. Yes, the Sharks were within 1 goal, but it felt like that type of game where on the road, where the Sharks are not playing particularly well, that Minnesota would come out in the first 2, 3, 4 minutes of this third period, they'd get an insurance goal, later they'd add a 3-0 goal, and then maybe the Sharks could get back 1 to make it slightly respectable and avoid a shutout, but ultimately they'd lose the game 4-1 by the end with an empty netter. But this is what tells you that this is a different season for this San Jose Sharks roster, at least up to this point, as they come out and their third period is their best period of the game, probably the only one that you could actually argue that they were the better team over Minnesota. They made some adjustments and they came out looking a lot better, and they end up getting a power play goal of their own coming from Will Smith off of a very nice passing play. That ties the game up at 1. And I'd actually tweeted at the end of the second period that this was the type of game that the Sharks were definitely needing a power play goal in. At even strength, they weren't able to get much space. They weren't able to get much generated. And with how good their goaltender was playing, you wanted to support him at least with 1 goal. And it would be easiest to get it when you have that man advantage. And while the Sharks power play has been very bad throughout this last few stretch of games with only that 1 singular goal against the Seattle Kraken, it does manage to come through in this one to tie this game up at 1. And so we head to the overtime. And you'll remember that it was only a couple of weeks ago when the Sharks played the Minnesota Wild for the first time this season where we also went to overtime. Now, that was a very different game. This one was a lot tighter thanks to some great goaltending, only 1-1 after regulation compared to the previous one, which was insanely back and forth 5-5 after regulation. And in that game, there was one where the Minnesota Wild had kept possession in the overtime for almost a full 4 minutes before finally Celebrini was able to get the breakaway going the other way, score that goal for the OT game winner. This one passed a little bit differently because the Sharks were actually able to win the opening faceoff, which gave possession to the Wenberg, Orlov, Eklund trio that the Sharks decided to start with, but eventually the puck made its way back to Minnesota, and they employed a very similar strategy as to what the Detroit Red Wings did against the Sharks about a week ago, which was when Celebrini and Smith are on the ice, just play for possession, don't try any risky maneuvers, and wait for them to either get tired out or to head off for a change. And so Minnesota, for a good 60, 75, 90 seconds in this overtime, decided to just hold the puck, do absolutely nothing with it. They didn't even get a shot attempt, I don't think, during that time. But eventually, Sam Dickinson was actually able to win a puck battle along the boards, get this one back for San Jose, feed the puck to Celebrini, who then gave it back to Sam Dickinson. At that point, you think the Sharks are going to reset, that both Celebrini and Smith would head off for a change, and indeed Smith did, but Celebrini stayed on the ice. A really risky, a really bold call to try and go for an offensive move in that position, because if it backfired, Celebrini being completely gassed at the end of his shift, you would think that he would not be able to get back into the play to actually be any sort of impact defensively. But he makes the risky call to stay on the ice, and it works out. He's able to find this pass through Jonas Brodin, get it to Colin Graf, who then does the rest with a beautiful move onto Philip Gustafsson, and that gets the Sharks the overtime victory, and as I said, puts them now on a 4-game winning streak, probably for the first time in many, many years at this point. Moving on to the players to talk about before we get into the forwards, into the defensemen, the player who we do have to start with is Yaroslav Askarov, who has just been on absolute fire as of late. He lets in just one singular goal, and he wasn't even expected to get the start here tonight. There was something that happened with Nedeljkovic, and so Askarov thrust into that position, probably unexpectedly so, and yet he still shows up and puts up one of his best performances of the season. This is following up on his elite performance the other night against the Florida Panthers, and then that was following up on the elite performance the other night before that against the Seattle Kraken. Askarov has just been going so well as of late. His stats that were absolutely awful to begin this year, thanks to some pretty poor outings, have recovered quite significantly so because of how much better that he has been looking. And this is exactly what, well, maybe not exactly, this is even better what people were thinking we would see from Askarov, but this is what you were looking for from this guy. This is the type of goaltender you were hoping he would be able to be, the guy who could steal your team games on a relatively consistent basis, and he has done that. He didn't quite need to steal the game against Seattle because obviously the Sharks backed it up with 6 goals, but against Florida and Minnesota, they desperately needed Askarov to be at his best, and he absolutely was. And so that slow start to the season that he had, those first couple of games that weren't great, that is completely in the rearview mirror now. It is sort of Askarov's world at this point. Now, it is important to mention that as a young goaltender and as this season goes on, there will be more outings in which Askarov does look a little bit shaky or does look a little bit out of it, where he gives up 3, 4, 5 goals. Maybe he gets pulled and Nedeljkovic has to come in relief. These are things that are expected to happen, but it is important to look back and remember these 3 games that he has played now in a row there, against Seattle, against Florida, against Minnesota, to really remember what he is truly capable of when he is at his best. And as he gets more experienced and older, these will be the games that we will see consistently from this player. Now, when it comes to the Sharks' first line, it remained, at least at the start, with Celebrini, Smith, and Tyler Toffoli. Now, for anyone who has watched any of my last few reviews, you will know that I am not really a fan of this setup. Celebrini and Smith remaining together is fine, but I didn't think Toffoli was a good fit for this trio. I've mentioned that so many times, and I even decided to do some research prior to this game to see if the kind of stats and the numbers actually backed up the idea here that Toffoli is not really managing to contribute as much as he had been in the previous season, and indeed the numbers are definitely there. So last season he put up 30 goals, as we know, and from an individual standpoint, he was averaging about 9 scoring chances per 60 minutes, as well as 3.2 high danger scoring chances per 60 minutes. This season, despite playing over 2/3 of his ice time on a line with Macklin Celebrini, who, as we know, has been insanely dominant thus far this season from an offensive production standpoint, Toffoli has dropped from 9 to just 6 scoring chances per 60 minutes, and from 3.2 to just 1.7 high danger scoring chances per 60 minutes. That is basically slashed in half. And so for those of us who was thinking Toffoli is not really getting into many good scoring positions anymore, it is absolutely absolutely the case. The numbers do back that up. He's just not been particularly effective at his major strength as a player, which is putting the puck in the back of the net. Now, he had made improvements in other areas. I think defensively he has been better this season than the last one. I think he's also been pretty solid on the breakout for this trio. But at some point, when it comes to the offensive zone, you needed him to kind of fill this sort of finisher type of role. He had not been doing a very good job of that. And so it was really only a matter of time, it felt, that the Sharks would actually decide to make a swap. And the winning that they have been doing as of late was kind of masking this issue of that top line. But with how this game had started, 40 minutes into it, not going particularly well, Warsofsky does decide to pull the trigger. He drops Toffoli down to the third line with Dellandrea and Skinner, and he ends up promoting Colin Graf. This was a player who many of us wanted to see in this exact position. I selfishly also wanted to see Eklund, just because that would be the three best players for the San Jose Sharks. It would be fun. But in the sort of effort to try and maintain that Sharks second line and the depth that they have there, Graf was definitely the next best option. And in that third period, it definitely sort of re-energized this top trio that hadn't been looking all that great up to that point. They had a few strong shifts. They drew a penalty. And then, of course, the power play goal, which helped out. And then Colin Graf managing the overtime game winner. And so this is probably a trio that I suspect to see be kept together heading into the next one on Thursday. Now, from an individual standpoint, Celebrini, it was a bit of a rough outing at first for Celebrini, who, as I had mentioned against the Florida Panthers, teams are going to start specifically targeting him and really trying to stay on him and not give him much space to work with. That was not any different here tonight against the Minnesota Wild. It was quite clear that after the last matchup that the Sharks had against this team that went 5-5 back and forth, that Minnesota did not want another game like that, and that they would sort of double down on trying to play more defensive hockey, and that's exactly what they did here. And so there was not a ton of space. Like, we even saw Celebrini draw an interference penalty on Joel Eriksson-Ek, who was just trying to give him literally no room on the forecheck to go in after that puck. And that was kind of a common occurrence across the entire game. Celebrini still had like a few decent moments where he was able to kind of intercept passes, get his sticks on pucks, and try to get something going in the offensive zone, but it wasn't super consistent. However, as I have mentioned time and time again, even in a game where maybe Celebrini isn't playing his best, he's still able to show why he is a superstar in this league. He finds the primary assist on both of these goals, the Smith one and the Colin Graf one, and both are very, very similar in that he is able to get the puck through a Minnesota Wild defenseman to its intended target. On the Smith goal, it was Jared Spurgeon. On the Graf goal, it was Jonas Brodin. And these are two very good defensemen, mind you, two underrated guys, but Spurgeon has been one of the better defensive defensemen in the league throughout his entire career. Basically, the same goes for Jonas Brodin. So not easy pickings here for Celebrini, who manages to pull it off anyway. Another couple of points here tonight for him. And so the similar situation for Will Smith, didn't really have the greatest start. What I will say about Smith is I do think he actually brought a higher level of energy to this game. There were a few times where on the forecheck, you actually saw him trying to lay the body, be a little bit more physical. Obviously, it was not working to like an exceptional extent. This isn't a Ryan Reeves type of player where you're kind of looking over your shoulder when he's on the ice to see that you don't take a huge hit. Smith doesn't have that type of imposing figure, but the fact that he was going for it, I thought was a positive sign. And then when it comes to Tyler Toffoli, as I mentioned, had just not really been a strong fit for this top line for multiple games in a row, definitely masked by the amount of winning that the Sharks had been doing, dropped now to that third line. And so his game performance here tonight, also not that great. When it comes to the Sharks' second line, we got to see the return of Eklund to the lineup. He rejoins immediately Wenberg and Kurashev. No surprises there. The Sharks had been trying to find a second line that could fill in the absence of Eklund. It didn't really work with Gaudette at all. It didn't really work with Skinner. And while it was okay with Colin Graf, it certainly wasn't optimal. And so getting Eklund back in here, you were wondering whether or not they'd be able to recapture the kind of lightning in a bottle that they had prior to Eklund's injury. And they absolutely did exactly that. Yes, this wasn't a game where they popped off with another like 2-3 goals at even strength here. They don't actually manage to get anything on the board, but that was not for a lack of trying and a lack of effort. In particular, William Eklund, I thought, was maybe the Sharks' best player on the ice, outside of Askarov, of course, in this game. He was all over it. He was making plays, truly driving this second line, and that was a huge deal because during Eklund's absence, in particular when it comes to Philip Kurashev, he was actually rather invisible in many of those games, not managing to do much of anything. But now that Eklund is back, that elevated Kurashev's game, that brought Wenberg back into more of an offensive spotlight. And so Eklund has not really skipped a beat at all due to this injury. He comes back, he immediately makes an impact. Very, very nice to see from him. And then when it comes to his two partners on this line, I should also mention that there was a good, strong defensive effort from all three of these players as well. They did not necessarily get some easy matchups in this game. There are some tough opponents on the Minnesota Wild side, whether that be Boldy or Kaprizov or Zuccarello or Rossi, whatever the case may be. They've got some strong offensive players. You know that this is a trio that obviously the Sharks, not being the home team, don't have the opportunity to hard match, but that they would be a trio facing off against some tough opponents, and they pretty much won their even strength ice time much more often than not compared to any other line on this team. When it comes to the Sharks' third line, as I said, it started off as Skinner, Dellandrea, and Graf, but then in the third period, we saw Graf get replaced by Tyler Toffoli. The player who actually stood out on this third line to me was actually Ty Dellandrea, who I think had a very nice game here tonight. He was very tenacious, very aggressive, going after players, actually managing to strip them of the puck a couple of times. The major issue that still remains for Ty Dellandrea is there isn't much of an offensive ceiling here for him, which does bring up another problem, which is that with Colin Graf filling in on this trio, I think you were a little bit more confident. I still don't really like this third line, but I thought you were a little bit more confident with having these three players together. But with Tyler Toffoli here now, you now have Toffoli and Skinner as your two wingers. These are guys who really need some setup on this line, and Dellandrea is not really going to provide that. This is where the injury to Michael Misa really hurts you, because I think if Misa were here and playing with Skinner and Toffoli, that might actually be an interesting third line setup, but not really the case for Dellandrea, despite the fact that I did like his game here tonight. Maybe we'll see the Gaudette for Dellandrea swap, but even then, I don't necessarily view Gaudette as a setup guy and much more of a finisher, and so having three finishers on your line isn't the best. We'll see what the Sharks decide to go with. The Toffoli for Graf swap, it definitely benefits the Sharks' top line. And I think that is like a primary goal here. I think you would want to try and put Celebrini in the best possible position to have success. Same goes for Will Smith, but it certainly hurts the Sharks' depth, at least while Michael Misa remains out of the lineup. When it comes to the other two players here, Colin Graf, it wasn't necessarily the best start to the game, but I thought he looked a lot better once he was placed on that top line. Surprise, surprise, playing with Celebrini and Smith makes you look better. I guess it is expected that that is the case. And then when it comes to Jeff Skinner, I didn't think he had like the most effective game here tonight. Definitely feel as though he was overshadowed by other players. Not all that great. Then we get to the Sharks' fourth line. Now, I'll give them a little bit of a pass here because I do think that the Sharks' fourth line has mostly been rather solid thus far this season. This game, however, was not it. They were hemmed into their own zone pretty much every single shift. It did not look good. None of these three players I thought had a particularly effective game whatsoever. Goodrow struggled, Reeves struggled, Gaudette struggled. Not a great look for them. I actually think not only would a Gaudette for Dellandrea swap potentially benefit the Sharks' third line, but probably also benefit the Sharks' fourth line by kind of putting together a trio that we know had been having success in the previous parts of this season. And then we get to the Sharks defensively, where we had a very interesting swap out of the lineup. So I have talked about how the Sharks defense, it is very cramped at this point. Something needs to give. Someone needs to get moved or traded or waived or whatever the case may be to try and create a little space here, because while the Sharks have been winning a lot of games this season, ultimately at the end of the day, this year is still very important for developing their players. And on the blue line, you look at both Mukhamadullin and Dickinson, and it had previously been looking like those two players would be in and out of the lineup in favor of the other throughout the next few games or few weeks or whatever the case may be, because the Sharks' top four would be set in stone as Liljegren, Orlov, Klingberg, and Ferraro, and then that fifth defenseman would be Desharnais because he has been very effective on the Sharks' penalty kill, and so that sixth guy would either be Dickinson or Mukhamadullin, and then Leddy would sort of just remain on the sidelines. But the Sharks decide to make a bold call, which is to actually have Timothy Liljegren sit out the game here tonight. Now, of those four defensemen who I mentioned in that top four lock, I would say Liljegren was the most likely to be healthy scratch, just because Orlov and Klingberg are the new faces here, and Warsofsky seems to like both of them. And then Ferraro is Mario Ferraro. He's not going anywhere, at least not in terms of a healthy scratch. And so Liljegren was kind of viewed as that guy, especially since basically ever since he took that puck to the face, he hasn't been looking all that great, has looked a lot more shaky. So perhaps this is actually a good thing that he does end up getting scratched. But what that does do is allow for both Mukhamadullin and Dickinson to be in the lineup for this particular game. Now, with Liljegren gone, Orlov did need a new defensive partner, and I'd mentioned that Mukhamadullin seemed like the right fit there, as just because both of these players, you would think that they'd have that chemistry together, and yet not really the case. This was kind of a disaster of a top pairing, or if you can call it a top pairing for the San Jose Sharks to begin this game. They seemed completely out of sync. I think both Orlov and Mukhamadullin individually struggled through the first part of this game, to the point where Warsofsky actually made a pretty quick change, dropping Mukhamadullin down to Mario Ferraro and having Klingberg play up with Dmitry Orlov. And I think this actually paid off very, very well, as both Orlov and Mukhamadullin at that point were able to rebound. It ended up being an all right game for Dmitry Orlov, though I will say this seems to be kind of a consequence of having both Mukhamadullin and Dickinson in the lineup as well, because Warsofsky doesn't want to seem to play either of them for an extended amount of minutes, and the fact that Desharnais also only ends up with about 16 here tonight. So Orlov gets close to 28 minutes in this game. Yes, he did have an overtime shift of about like a minute and a half, however long, but still at even strength and regulation, he played a ton, which is not really something that the Sharks are going to want to make a habit of. But at the very least, as I said, he did bring it back in the latter parts of the game. Same goes for Mukhamadullin. On the Sharks' second defensive pairing, here we have John Klingberg, always a very interesting player to talk about. There was actually some decent positives in this game from Klingberg when it came from an offensive standpoint. I still believe that he is one of the more kind of skilled defensemen on this roster, and he's actually being able to show it on a relatively consistent basis. Didn't do it against Florida, but he did do it quite effectively against the Winnipeg Jets, and I thought this was kind of more of a middle ground here where he had a few nice plays. But at the same time, Klingberg does remain relatively brutal in his own zone. There were definitely some major errors that he was making in the third period, 2 different shifts where it felt as though he just kind of zoned out and caught himself way too far up in the offensive zone. A guy easily got behind him and then got a great chance onto Yaroslav Askarov. That's not what you want. And the big issue here is that you can say, well, the offense is worth it for the struggles defensively, and that would be the case if the Sharks were actually kind of sheltering Klingberg for that type of position. But the thing is here, especially once they made that swap up to the top pairing with Dmitry Orlov, is that Klingberg is being used in really tight defensive situations. Like, he was literally on the ice for the final shift of the regulation with the game tied at 1. This is a massive risk for Ryan Warsofsky to take. Now, luckily, the San Jose Sharks have gotten elite goaltending over these last couple of weeks, and so a lot of their defensive errors have not ended up in the back of their net, and so they are much easier to overlook. But at some point, their goaltending is going to come back down to earth. They're going to have a game where they let in 3, 4, 5, maybe even more goals than that if they end up in the sort of wrong place at the wrong time. And that's where these defensive mistakes, especially from a player like Klingberg, are really going to stand out if he is getting this much even strength ice time in these tougher situations. So for me, we talk about, or Ryan Warsofsky at the very least talks about how the history of John Klingberg is the reason why he continues to maintain this top power play unit spot. And by the way, despite the fact that the Sharks' top power play unit does score here tonight, Klingberg does not factor into it whatsoever. But he points to Klingberg's success as a power play quarterback 4 years ago as a reason for why he is doing it now. Well, if you go back 4 years, Klingberg was terrible defensively. He has been for much of his career. So you would think that after multiple injuries, multiple surgeries at now 33 years of age, that will not be turning around in the positive sense. And so you're playing with fire, constantly putting Klingberg into these defensive situations. I'll say that. When it comes to his defensive partner at the start of this game, but then eventually with Mukhamadullin, Ferraro, I think actually looked pretty good here tonight. I thought his penalty kill work, despite that one pass getting through from Zuccarello to Boldy, I thought was actually pretty good. And defensively, I thought he was mostly solid. There was definitely one really big turnover that he had, I believe, in the third period that was absolutely disastrous. But I guess besides that, he looked all right. And then when it comes to the Sharks' third defensive pairing, starting off with Desharnais, because he had such an outstanding game against the Florida Panthers just a few days ago. Not quite able to manage to match that one, especially since the Sharks didn't have to go shorthanded as many times as they did against Florida. But still, I thought Desharnais was actually one of the Sharks' better defensemen yet again, so he remains pretty solid in his own zone. And then when it comes to Sam Dickinson, this was an an interesting night, let's just say, for Dickinson. The last time the Sharks played against the Minnesota Wild, he struggled due to a lack of confidence, it felt, wasn't really able to execute on a lot of his plays. That wasn't a major problem here tonight. It did feel as though Sam Dickinson was playing rather aggressively throughout much of this game. That was something that did work out occasionally and then did also come back to backfire. For instance, there were a few moments where he was stepping up extremely aggressively in the neutral zone. Twice, I believe, it actually did burn him and allow for a good chance going the other way for Minnesota. There was also a shift in the first period, when this does remain an issue for Sam Dickinson, where when things kind of get turned around a little bit in the defensive zone, he can get lost in sort of his positioning, and then he ends up just kind of doubling up on a certain player with one of his teammates, and that leaves us part of the ice completely uncovered. And so Dickinson will have to, with reps, of course, this is important and why he needs to continue to get these games. With reps, he'll come to realize that, he can be a little bit more settled in the defensive zone in these moments of heavy pressure, but there were still a lot of positives here tonight. I thought offensively he was managing to chip in here or there, and then I of course brought up the fact in the overtime that he makes the very key puck battle victory to get the Sharks back into possession, and then ends up even getting his first career assist with the secondary assist on this Colin Graf goal. So ultimately I thought this was a relatively positive night for Sam Dickinson, about as positive as you could get from a night that where the Sharks were certainly not at their best defensively. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action on Thursday. We'll be taking on the Calgary Flames. The Flames, I believe, are literally last place in the entire NHL. They have taken the position of the San Jose Sharks over these last couple of years. This is a pretty big surprise because the Flames were just a point or two out of a playoff spot just last season. But despite the fact that they still got Dustin Wolf and they've got Nazem Kadri and Zane Parekh has come up here to play his first full season in the NHL, things just have not been put together for Calgary. They're struggling to score. And so San Jose, there's an opportunity here for them to be able to claim yet another win in a row. Class dismissed.